So maybe you're looking to buy a camera in 2024 and you're eyeballing the Panasonic S5 Mark II or the S5 Mark IIX, but you're not sure if the Panasonic ecosystem is right for you. Well, in this video, let's talk about a couple of things that you should consider before picking up an S5 Mark II or an S5 Mark IIX, or if you should look at some other ecosystems like Sony. I've had the S5 Mark II for quite a while now, about a little over a year, and so far it's served me pretty well. I think it's an amazing camera and package for what you get. There are some quirks with the camera. I sang high praises about it last year, and I still think it's incredible for what you get. However, like I said, there are some quirks, and I think the biggest thing, sorry, I thought I heard a fire truck behind me. By the way, you can get them at a really good price now. The S5 Mark II is going for about $1,700 brand new, and you can find them used for about $1,500. This is actually kind of a pro and a con because it just says that like Panasonic cameras, they don't tend to retain their resale value as well as some other brands, but you can get them at a pretty affordable price. So that is a positive. One of the things though that is great about the Panasonic S5 Mark II is that you get the 6K open gate in, it's a full frame camera and you're getting 6K open gate. You do have 4K in 24/30 obviously, but you also have 4K in 60 frames per second. However, it is APS-C crop if you're shooting in 4K 60. Mind you, you do get 4K 48 frames per second, which a lot of cameras don't let you shoot in. It is kind of a unique frame rate, so just keep that in mind. I don't know how many people really need 48 frames per second, but it is something that Panasonic likes to keep retained in their cameras as an option. If you go with an S5 Mark II or an S5 Mark IIX, just one thing to keep in mind though is that this is an issue that I've experienced and a couple of other people online, by a couple I mean a certain amount of people. I don't know exactly the accurate number, but there's a lot of people that are reporting some issues with the preamps in the S5 Mark II and the S5 Mark IIX. There's a clicking sound that you get when you change the sound record gain level setting in the camera to low. All right, guys. So I had to leave the skate park. Some kids wanted to go skate, so I wasn't gonna obviously hog the skate park when that's really what it's meant to be used for. But like I was saying before, the preamps on the S5 Mark II and the S5 Mark IIX are not the greatest, at least in my experience so far, but I do believe that is an issue that Panasonic has at least acknowledged. I don't know if I can address it. I might have to send mine in for repairs, but if you do look at picking up one of these two cameras, just kind of keep that in mind. I would definitely try to listen with headphones and see if you can pick up that clicking or crickety noise that comes into the preamps when recording audio on the mic jack. But going back to what I was saying about whether or not you should pick up an S5 Mark II or an S5 Mark IIX in 2024, they are at pretty great prices right now, and for what you get, it is a pretty solid package when you look at the competition. For example, the Canon R6 Mark II and the Sony A7 IV. If you do need 4K 60 in full frame and you don't want to compromise with 4K 60 and APS-C, then go with the Canon R6 Mark II for sure. However, just know that the ecosystem for the lenses is going to be quite a bit more expensive than Sony or Panasonic and possibly even Nikon. Yeah, no, definitely more expensive than Nikon as well. The camera's great. I'm sure it's solid. There's, from what I've heard, no real overheating issues like they had with the Canon R6 and the Canon R5. However, it only lasts in 4K 60 for about like 40 or 45 minutes before it does overheat and shuts the camera off. But I don't think that you really need to be shooting 4K 60 for that long anyway. And that's only if that's really that important to you. Other than that, I would say there's really no other reason besides maybe the autofocus is a bit better than the S5II and the S5IIX. If you don't really care about that though, the A7 IV is a great option if you want to stay in Sony's ecosystem. You can get an A7 IV at a pretty good price right now, especially considering the fact that it's been out for a while. It was $2,500 brand new, which was more expensive than the S5II and the S5IIX when they were announced, but you can get an A7 IV used for About under $2,000 or about $2,000 now. So if you want to stay in, or if you want to go into Sony's ecosystem, sorry, leaves are brushing over the concrete here. If you want to go into Sony's ecosystem, then the A7 IV is a solid option. There is, or at least I've heard, there are some overheating issues, even with some of the firmware updates, even up until now. But your mileage may vary on that front. The Panasonic S5II and the S5IIX, they both have cooling fans, built-in active cooling fans in the bodies. And so I've never had this camera overheat. It's not been a concern of mine whatsoever. The fan is really solid. I haven't recorded a very long video in 6K open gate or 5.9K, but I have not had any overheating issues, and I really don't think I will, just because of the fact that it has an active cooling fan. Now, the autofocus performance on the S5II and the S5IIX, they did introduce phase detect autofocus in these two bodies. However, they aren't probably quite up to the level of performance in the A7 IV and the Canon R6 Mark II, possibly even the Nikon Z6 Mark II, although I don't have a lot of experience with Nikon cameras, so I really can't say much in regard to that. If you want uncompromised autofocus performance, I would go with the Sony A7 IV or the Canon R6 Mark II. That does not mean you can't get good autofocus performance with the S5II and the S5 Mark IIX. It's just you kind of have to tweak the settings a bit, and there are some informational videos on Lumix's channel regarding this. Right now, if I look at my screen, it does look like I'm in focus, and I'm on the face-only autofocus mode. And yeah, I mean, this is a pretty good setting for just these static shots, talking head shots. The autofocus is, you'll see in some of my other videos, like it does kind of shift back and forth a little bit here and there, but I really think that's a configuration issue on my part. I can't say that I fully trust it just yet. And not that you should trust any autofocus system, even ones that are better than this. But for static shots like this, talking head videos, it's more than fine. And if I'm going to be shooting somebody anyway, then I will be behind the camera and I can adjust focus on the fly for the most part. But yes, I do think the autofocus performance in Canon and Sony cameras today is better than the S5II and the S5IIX, but it's not bad. It's not like the contrast detect autofocus that we've had in previous Panasonic cameras. So don't think that you're going to get some really bad, terrible autofocus performance. But I have heard people, and I don't shoot that many videos where there's a multiple amount of people in the frame, but it does have some issues if you've got like, you know, several people in the frame and you're trying to autofocus on one of those subjects. I'm sure Panasonic might be able to tweak this in the future, but it is something to consider depending on what you're trying to shoot. That being said, the Panasonic ecosystem, the lens options as well, they are a little bit more limited than Sony. But against Canon though, I mean, if you look at Canon's ecosystem, yeah, you can adapt the EF lenses to the Canon R6 or the R6 Mark II, or even the, you know, Canon R8. Oh, I forgot to mention the Canon R8. Canon R8 is a great option too if you don't mind not having dual SD card slots. That could be a solid camera as well if you're looking to stay within the full frame space. But you're going to pay an arm and a leg for Canon RF lenses. So if you are on somewhat of a budget, you're probably better off sticking with EF lenses. If you want to stay with, you don't want to adapt lenses and you want an ecosystem where you can get good quality lenses at a decent price without, you know, breaking the bank, the Panasonic system is pretty solid. I mean, I love the 18mm f1.8, which I'm shooting on right now, and their prime lenses are awesome. Their other prime lenses are awesome too. Like the 35mm f1.8, which I've shot a couple of videos on. I think overall Panasonic has a pretty decent ecosystem. They still have to develop more and flesh it out a little bit more. They don't have the like really high-end telephoto lenses like Sony and Canon do. They're not, you know, you're not going to go to like a sports game and see Panasonic shooters, you know, shooting, you know, college basketball or an NFL game or whatever. Panasonic just isn't really the system for that. It's a new system. People are I think historically people have been just shooting Nikon and Canon, and now Sony's kind of broken into that space because they've introduced such high-speed camera systems and those really huge lenses. They've done a lot of research and development into that space. But I don't really shoot that. I'm just talking about content creation on the internet or video production where you're doing maybe talking head videos, or you know, maybe you're trying to record, maybe you're just, I really don't know what you're trying to shoot. At the end of the day, it really depends on what you are trying to shoot. One thing that's kind of interesting too with the A7S III firmware update, I didn't even realize this, but the A7S III, I thought that you were shooting in true 24 frames per second with that camera, but as part of the firmware update, they actually introduced 24 FPS, like the true 24 FPS feature in that camera, which by default comes with the S5II and the S5IIX. With the A7S III, when you selected 24 frames per second, you were shooting in like 23.98. And you can still do that, I think, on this camera as well, and some other cameras. I think by default, they just threw in 23.98. But I know this is a very small little thing or a little detail, but yeah, you can shoot true 24 frames per second with this camera. Another cool thing as well is the custom LUTs feature. I know with Sony, I think they're guarding it for the FX line, because in the firmware update that was just released for the A7S III, you can't load custom LUTs still. It's not something that was included in the firmware update. Yeah, they introduced focus breathing into the A7S III and the 24 frames per second. There was a couple other features that they introduced too. A new like overhaul of the menu system, and I know that they released their new mobile camera app, but yeah, you can't load custom LUTs into the A7S III, where I think you can do that with the, yeah, no, you can definitely do it with the FX30, and you can definitely do it with the FX3. So yeah, if you shoot a lot of log and you want to have custom LUTs baked into your image right in the camera, that's something you can do with the S5II and the S5IIX. Now, in terms of 4K 60, 4K 60 is pretty much reserved for APS-C mode. You cannot shoot 4K 60 full frame with the S5II or the S5IIX. You can't do it in the A7 IV. And I'm talking about the mirrorless cameras in that $1,500 to $2,000 price range. The A7S III obviously can shoot 4K 120, and some of the other high-end Sony cameras. For Canon, if you're shooting on the Canon R6 Mark II, you can shoot 4K 60 in full frame mode. That's one of the few cameras in this price range where you can do that. And even the original R6, the Canon R8, you can do that, although that only has one SD card slot. So if you're trying to do this professionally, like let's say you want to shoot for a client, I would definitely hold back on the R8 as a camera to use, just because you do not have the dual SD card recording. So just keep that in mind. But if that doesn't matter, then R8 is a great camera. Oh, I got a bug on the lens here. Anyway, so to wrap this video up, I've been rambling on for a little while, and the dogs are barking across the lake. The S5II and the S5IIX are great options in 2024, but just keep those things in mind. One other key detail with the S5II and the S5IIX that I think a lot of people don't know about is that if you want to shoot in high frame rate modes in full frame view, so like you have to drop down to HD to do that because the 4K 60 is an APS-C mode. The HD modes, like 60, 120, you are going to go into phase detect autofocus. This is something that I don't think a lot of people were clear on. Panasonic has said that it is a hybrid phase detect autofocus system. And so this was a compromise that they did. I think it might have something to do with the processor that they included in the S5II and the S5IIX. I myself don't shoot a lot of high-speed content, so it's not a big deal for me. And if I have to shoot in 60 frames per second, I'll probably just default to the 4K 60. But you will lose phase detect autofocus in the high frame rate modes in HD. It sucks. I'm sure a lot of people don't like that. That is not an issue when you go with a Sony A7 IV. You can use the phase detect autofocus in all of those HD modes. So I will say that is a weakness of the Panasonic S5II and the S5IIX. Having said all that, the S5II and the S5IIX, I think personally from my experience, I've loved the interface, the controls, the dials, the buttons, how things are just laid out, the screen, the overall shooting experience for me is a little bit better than Sony. As far as Canon, I think Canon's quite a bit different. That's just been my experience with the ecosystem. I do think they're great cameras. I do think now that the price has dropped a bit, they would be a solid option for anybody that's looking to get into the full frame space. And the Panasonic ecosystem is only going to get better from here. And another thing that's cool is that you can find, and if you don't mind, not using the autofocus, you can find some pretty affordable Micro Four Thirds cameras as backup cameras for the S5II and the S5IIX, or even original S5. I could go and pick up like a GH5, the OG, or an S5 original and get it for, a fraction of what it came out for originally. And I probably won't do that. I might get another S5II or an S5IIX once I've addressed the preamp issue. Or I might wait to see what Panasonic releases. I don't know if I'll buy a brand new Panasonic camera right away. I might wait 6 months to a year before I do that. But yeah, those are just my thoughts right now in 2024 with Panasonic in comparison to Sony and Canon. I know I didn't really talk much about Nikon. It is cool that they acquired Red, and I'm sure there's future developments that we will be excited to see. Having said all that, I really appreciate you guys checking out this video. What do you guys think of the Panasonic S5 Mark II, S5 Mark IIX? Is it something that you're looking at picking up in 2024? Or are you guys jumping into Sony or Canon, or are you staying in those ecosystems? Are you thinking of changing over from one to the other? Let me know in the comments below. And as always, peace.